almost died. Not metaphorically, literally. Hit by a truck after a night shift. I was rushed to the ICU. The doctors called my mom. She said, I'm walking my sister's dog. I can't come. Autumn in Boston is brief. On an October afternoon, as the cold wind began to scatter the leaves of the street trees, Clara Bennett, a nurse at Central Hospital, was about to finish her long night shift. After checking her patient's charts one last time and handing over to the next shift's nurse, she headed for the locker room. Another tough day, Clara, said Rachel, a senior nurse. Any plans for the weekend? Spending time with family? Clara smiled and shook her head. No, my mother and sister are going shopping in New York tomorrow. I'll be at home battling a mountain of laundry. You always seem to take on all the housework, Rachel said with sympathetic eyes. Don't you ever take some time for yourself? It's fine. I'm used to it, Clara shrugged. She didn't say it out loud, but caring for her family had become her habit. In the Watson household, it was taken for granted that Clara would handle most of the chores. Clara left the hospital and returned to her lonely apartment building. Her apartment was modest but kept clean. The refrigerator was adorned with many postcards from her father, held up by magnets: London, Paris, Rome, names of cities marking his work travels. Richard Bennett was an executive at a large trading company and traveled overseas frequently. He had a calm and rational personality, but he had always regarded Clara as special. When Clara decided to become a nurse, he was the only one who supported her decision. The phone rang and Clara hurried to answer it. It was her mother, Lillian. Clara, do you remember the dinner party tomorrow? Sophie's designer friend is coming, so be back by 6. Yes, I remember. Have you finished the shopping? Oh well, Lillian said awkwardly. Sophie and I decided to go shopping in New York tomorrow afternoon. We'll be back by evening, but could you take care of the shopping and dinner preparations? Clara suppressed a sigh. All right. I've taken time off, so it's fine. Thank you as always, Clara. You're always so dependable, Lillian said. Since you're a nurse and independent, these things are no problem for you. Sophie is still establishing her career, so networking is important for her. After hanging up, Clara sank into the sofa. Her sister Sophie worked as a freelance interior designer. Talented, charming, and sociable, Sophie was her parents' favorite. Her mother, in particular, showed strong interest in her daughter's social success. Clara's cell phone rang. Looking at the screen, Clara saw it was a video call from her father. Clara, how are you? Richard's face appeared on the screen. He seemed to be calling from a hotel room. I'm fine, Dad. Where are you now? Paris. Planning to fly to Brussels tomorrow. Richard showed a tired expression but smiled. A new project has started. It looks like I'll be on an extended trip in Europe. How long? Clara asked, worried. About 3 months, I'd say, Richard said apologetically. I'm sorry. I won't make it back for your birthday. Don't worry about it. Is work difficult? Yes, but I'll definitely call you. Richard's expression turned serious. Clara, contact me right away if anything happens. Anytime is fine. I understand, Clara smiled. Her father's kindness warmed her heart. And please look after Lillian and Sophie too. They'd be lost without you, Richard added with a joking tone. But there was truth in his words. Of course, as always, Clara answered lightly. The following week, Richard departed for Europe. Clara returned to her busy routine, alternating between night and day shifts. At home, housework for her mother and sister always awaited her. Her presence was taken for granted, and her efforts were rarely acknowledged. Then came the fateful day. On a cold, rainy evening in early November, Clara was leaving the hospital after finishing her night shift. As she was crossing an intersection with her exhausted body, a large truck that should have stopped at the red light came skidding toward her. With the impact came darkness. Clara's consciousness returned in flashes. It felt like being underwater. People were bustling around her, and voices could be heard from a distance. The emergency room at Central Hospital was filled with tension. The medical staff worked as one to save the life of their colleague, Clara Bennett. It's Watson. She was on her way home after the night shift, exclaimed Dr. Martin, the emergency department chief. Contact her family. From Clara's personal file, her mother Lillian's phone number was found as the emergency contact. A young nurse dialed the number with trembling hands. Outside, it was still dark before dawn. Hello, Mrs. Watson. This is the emergency department at Central Hospital. Your daughter Clara has been in a traffic accident. On the other end, Lillian answered in a sleepy voice. Clara? What happened? She's in critical condition. Could you come to the hospital right away? After a moment of silence, an unexpected reply came back. I'm out walking my sister's dog right now, so I can't. Perhaps I can come in the afternoon. The young nurse listened in disbelief and asked again. Ma'am, your daughter is in a very dangerous condition. She has multiple traumas and is bleeding. Could you please come right now? I told you I can't right now, Lillian snapped. Sophie's poodle is on a strict schedule. Besides, Sophie and I have plans to go to New York this afternoon. The call ended. The young nurse stood frozen. Then she turned and reported the situation to Dr. Martin. The doctor frowned, but treating the patient was the priority now. Let's try calling again later. For now, let's focus on saving her life. Clara was taken to the emergency operating room. Internal ruptures, multiple fractures, head trauma. Her condition was deteriorating by the minute. The surgery lasted 6 hours. By the time it ended, it was already past noon. Dr. Martin called Lillian again. This time, his tone was firm. Mrs. Watson, your daughter's condition is extremely critical. She has multiple fractures, internal injuries, and brain edema. I strongly recommend that you come as soon as possible. I understand, Lillian replied curtly. But there was no further response. Clara was moved to the ICU. Only machines and 4-4 stands surrounded her bed. There was no sign of family. Instead, her fellow nurses took turns sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. Clara, can you hear me? We're here with you, Rachel whispered. Hang on. You can definitely overcome this. As the night deepened, Lillian and Sophie still hadn't appeared. Someone suggested contacting Richard in Europe, but his number wasn't listed in the emergency contacts registered by Lillian. Clara's cell phone had been shattered in the accident, along with her bag. On the afternoon of the second day, Lillian and Sophie finally showed up at the hospital. They were carrying designer brand shopping bags and looked visibly annoyed by the ICU's visiting restrictions. Only 15 minutes? You must be joking. We came all the way back from New York, Sophie complained to the nurse. Lillian and Sophie put on protective gowns and were guided to Clara's bedside, accompanied by Rachel. Clara was connected to a ventilator, her swollen face covered in deep purple bruises. Her body was surrounded by machines and medical tubes. Oh, what a troublesome child, Lillian sighed. She stood at the edge of the bed without touching Clara's hand. Don't tell your father. It will only worry him. Then she added coldly, honey, get better soon. We don't have time to take care of you. Sophie glanced at her phone. Let's go back soon, Mom. We'll be late for dinner with Jeff. Before the 15-minute visit was over, the two left the room. Rachel, trembling with anger but holding it in as a professional, continued to tend to Clara with care. In her fading consciousness, Clara had heard fragments of her mother and sister's conversation. Her heart froze, not from the physical pain, but from the chilling reality. In the midst of this, a question formed in her mind. Why hadn't her father contacted her? If he knew the situation, he would surely come running. The third and fourth days passed. Clara's condition fluctuated. Her colleagues stayed close, taking turns to sit by her between their shifts. Lillian and Sophie never returned. On the evening of the fifth day, Clara's consciousness flickered back. She whispered in a hoarse voice, Papa. Rachel, who was in the room, quickly gripped her hand. Clara, can you hear me? Move your finger. Clara moved her finger slightly. It was enough to make Rachel cry. Thank goodness. Thank goodness, she whispered, gently kissing Clara's forehead. We're trying to contact your father, but he's overseas. Clara closed her eyes again. But her brain was gradually regaining function. She tried to piece together the situation from the fragmented conversations she'd overheard. Why was there no contact from her father? Why hadn't her mother and sister informed him? By the seventh day, Clara's condition miraculously began to stabilize. She could breathe without the ventilator for short periods, and her consciousness was becoming clearer. The doctors were amazed at her resilience. Nurses are tough, Dr. Martin said, delighted with her progress. Your recovery is a medical miracle, Clara. Clara asked Rachel for paper and a pen. With a shaking hand, she wrote a single question. Contact Dad. Rachel hesitated, showing a troubled expression. Your mother told us not to inform him, but of course we should. Do you have his contact information? Clara nodded weakly and tried to write a number on another sheet. Her hand trembled, and the pen slipped. Instead, she managed to write Dad's company. Rachel understood immediately. I see. Richard Bennett, European branch manager of Global Trading Company. I'll try to find him. Clara squeezed Rachel's hand, her touch conveying deep gratitude. But in her mind, her mother's words kept repeating, don't tell your father. Why didn't Lillian want him to know? What was she trying to hide? Clara made a quiet decision. She had the right to know the truth, and her father had the right to know as well. Despite her weakness, she began to formulate a plan. On the morning of the 8th day after the accident, the Boston sky was covered in a leaden blanket of clouds. A luxury SUV slid into the Central Hospital parking lot, and Lillian and Sophie stepped out, designer bags in hand. The two looked visibly tired from the previous night's party. "Let's get this over with quickly," Lillian muttered. "We need to make it to our spa appointment this afternoon." "Why does Clara always cause problems?" Sophie sighed. "Dad's coming back the day after tomorrow, and now we're stuck in this mess." Lillian's face tightened. "I haven't told your father about the accident. I told him Clara's been in bed for a few days with a simple cold. But what if Dad tries to call her directly?" "Clara's cell phone was destroyed in the accident," Lillian replied. "Besides, he thinks she's working night shifts, so he won't find it odd if she doesn't answer." Sophie shrugged. "Anyway, today let's just say Dad's worried about you too and leave quickly." They approached the ICU nurse station. "We're here to visit Clara Bennett," Lillian announced. The nurse checked the chart, then hesitated with a slightly confused expression. "Mrs. Watson, this way, please." Lillian and Sophie followed her, unaware of what was coming. The solemn atmosphere of the ICU surrounded them. In nearby rooms, family members sat in prayer, whispered encouragements, or wept quietly by their loved ones' bedsides. However, no such emotions were visible on their faces. The nurse stopped in front of a bed by the window. As the curtain was drawn aside, Lillian gasped at the sight. The bed was empty. The sheets were neatly made, and the 4 stands and heart monitor had been removed. Clara was nowhere to be seen. "Has she been transferred somewhere?" Lillian asked, her voice tinged more with displeasure than concern. The nurse answered calmly, "No, she's been discharged." "Discharged?" Sophie exclaimed. "But wasn't she in critical condition?" "Ms. Watson's recovery was remarkable," the nurse explained. "Though she was in a dangerous state for a while, with her strong will and resilience, she was given permission to leave last night." "But where did she go?" Lillian asked, confused. "She hasn't come home." "I'm sorry, but I cannot answer questions regarding a patient's privacy," the nurse said politely. Lillian scowled. "I'm her mother. I have a right to know." "Oh, Mom, look," Sophie pointed at the bed. "There's something there." In the center of the mattress lay a white envelope. On the surface, in careful handwriting, were the words, "For Lillian Bennett." Lillian quickly snatched the envelope and pulled out a folded memo. As her eyes scanned the text, the color drained from her face. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, unnerved by her mother's sudden change. Lillian's hands trembled. She sat down on the edge of the bed and began to read aloud in a shaking voice. To Lillian. "If you're reading this, you've finally come to the hospital. It's been 8 days since the accident. In an accident at an intersection after my night shift, I nearly died. Even when the doctor said, 'Tonight is critical,' you replied, 'I'm walking my sister's dog, so I can't come.'" Lillian's voice cracked. Sophie sat beside her and leaned in to read the letter. "Even while I was unconscious, you came only once. And during that visit you said, 'Don't tell your father.' Why? Why didn't you tell Dad?" Sophie turned to her mother. "Mom, this is," Lillian continued reading, biting her lip. "I wondered why Dad wasn't contacting me. He would be worried, I know he would. Then I realized the truth. You never told him." Lillian's face went pale, her hands shaking more violently. "But that was just the beginning. As I began to regain consciousness, I asked Rachel to contact Dad's company. Then a surprising truth came to light. Dad wasn't in Europe. He was in Asia. What he told you was a 3-week business trip, not 3 months." Sophie gasped. "Mom, what does this mean?" Lillian's face contorted with dread. She stopped reading. "Read the rest," Sophie said firmly, pulling the memo from her mother's hands. "So I investigated further. Your story about Dad's 3-month business trip was a lie. Why would you tell such a lie? I found the answer. Having lost my cell phone, I thought to use the house phone, and I quietly returned home last night. Then I heard your voice coming from the living room. You were talking to a man." Lillian covered her face and began to sob. "Richard won't be back for 3 weeks. Don't worry," you were saying. "When I opened the door slightly, I saw it all with Greg Holloway, your lover." Sophie stood up, holding the letter in stunned silence. And then, the most shocking thing I've ever heard. "We must keep it a secret that Sophie is not his daughter. DNA doesn't lie," you said. The paper slipped from Sophie's hands. She stared at her mother in disbelief. "Mom, is this true?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lillian, sobbing, reached for her daughter's hand. But Sophie pulled away, backing up. My father, isn't Dad? Her voice trembled as her world crumbled. Lillian couldn't answer. Her hands trembling, she picked up the memo and read to the end. I gathered all the evidence. Recordings of your conversations, copies of emails between you and Greg, and Sophie's DNA test results. I sent all of these to Dad by international mail this morning. He has the right to know the truth. Goodbye, Lillian. From your daughter. Clara. The moment she finished reading, Lillian's phone rang. The screen lit up with a single name, Richard. She fumbled to answer, hands shaking, but the call cut off before she could press the button. It was too late. Clara had already revealed everything. What should I do? Lillian whispered, collapsing onto the bed. Richard knows. Sophie stood near the window, keeping distance from her mother. Her world had shattered over the last 8 days, and now, the pieces lay at her feet, irreparable, unforgivable. Meanwhile, in a suite on the 34th floor of the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Hong Kong, Richard Bennett stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the vibrant night skyline. The restructuring of the Asian branch was progressing more smoothly than expected. If all continued as planned, he'd be back in Boston by tomorrow afternoon. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Come in. The hotel concierge entered holding a package. Mr. Watson, a delivery for you. It's international mail. Thank you, Richard replied, taking the brown envelope. After the concierge left, he looked it over. It had a Boston postmark. The sender, Clara Bennett. Richard smiled. Unexpected mail from his daughter, perhaps something thoughtful, something personal. So very Clara. But as he opened it, the contents told a different story. Inside was a USB flash drive, several photographs, and a letter. He unfolded the paper. To my dear Dad. As you read this letter, you will undoubtedly be shocked. But you have the right to know the truth. Last week, I was in a traffic accident. A collision with a large truck. I was critically injured and hovered between life and death. The color drained from Richard's face. He sank into a nearby chair, gripping the paper. Mother did not tell you. She said I was simply in bed with a cold. Even when the doctors told her tonight is critical, she refused to come to the hospital. His hands began to shake. The words hit harder than anything he had expected. When I regained consciousness, I wondered why you hadn't contacted me. Then I learned she told you that your trip would last 3 months when in fact it was only 3 weeks. Why would she lie? By chance I discovered the truth. Richard continued reading, each line unraveling the life he thought he knew. Clara's account of returning home, overhearing Lillian's voice, witnessing her with Greg Holloway, and then the most damning piece of all, the conversation confirming that Sophie was not his biological daughter. The letter ended with, the evidence is in the USB. Recordings of their conversations, email exchanges, and Sophie's DNA test results. Richard reached for his laptop. Hands still shaking, he inserted the USB. There it was. Every word Clara had written was confirmed. In the audio files, he heard Lillian's voice, warm, flirtatious, laughing with Greg Holloway. They discussed plans for secret meetings while Richard was away. Every inflection, every pause, every cruel deception was captured. The email history documented a relationship spanning over 20 years. Finally, Richard opened the PDF containing the DNA test results. Among the clinical terminology, one line jumped out at him. 0% probability of paternity. Richard turned away from the screen and walked back to the window. He looked out over the dazzling skyline of Hong Kong, but all he could see was the ruin of 28 years of married life collapsing like dust around him. Clara. He murmured softly, his daughter, his only real daughter. Boston Logan International Airport. Richard emerged from the terminal with a weary expression. The 20-hour flight had drained both his body and spirit. But fatigue wasn't what weighed on his heart, it was anger and a quiet, relentless resolve. He hailed a taxi and asked to be taken to Central Hospital. At reception, he gave Clara's name. She's already been discharged, the nurse replied. Discharged? But wasn't she seriously injured? Her recovery was remarkable, the nurse explained. Her colleague, Rachel Moore, said she would care for her at home. The doctor gave permission. Richard let out a long breath. Relief, disbelief, and grief mingled in his chest. At least Clara was safe. He asked for Rachel's contact information, planning to visit her later. But first, there was something he had to confront. He took another taxi this time to his home. As the car rolled through the quiet, tree-lined streets of the upscale neighborhood, Richard felt his pulse quicken. The house he had built, lived in, and loved for over 2 decades now felt like a stranger. He opened the front door quietly and stepped inside. From the living room, voices. Lillian and Sophie. When Lillian saw him, she gasped. Richard. You weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow. Work finished early, Richard said flatly. His eyes scanned the room, suitcases, half-filled boxes, scattered packing tape. Something was clearly in motion. Preparing to move? Lillian's face stiffened. Richard, I didn't answer your call. I can explain, he cut her off. His tone was cold, measured. Can you explain over 20 years of lies? Sophie stood frozen in the corner, her eyes swollen, red from crying. She didn't say a word. Where is Clara? Richard asked. I don't know, Lillian stammered. She discharged herself. By herself. Richard's voice rose, fury edging every word. She was nearly dying and you let her leave alone? You don't understand, Lillian said. I had circumstances. Enough. Richard raised his hand, silencing her. I heard everything. From Clara. I saw the evidence about you and Greg Holloway. And about Sophie's father. Sophie sniffled. I didn't know anything, she whispered. Dad, I mean. Mr. Richard. Richard looked at her for a long moment. His eyes surprisingly held sadness rather than rage. Sophie, this isn't your fault. You're a victim too. Lillian collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard, please forgive me. Forgive you? He echoed, his tone bitter. After deceiving me for over 20 years? After letting me raise Sophie, knowing she wasn't my child? His voice cracked, emotion rising. But the worst, is that when Clara, my only daughter, was fighting for her life. He stared at Lillian, trembling. You abandoned her. Lillian couldn't respond. Her tears flowed in silence. I want an explanation, Richard said, folding his arms. Why did you hide Clara's accident? Why didn't you tell me? Lillian looked up, voice shaking. Because if you came back, I wouldn't be able to see Greg. Richard was speechless at that excessively honest answer. He shook his head and said quietly, Clara was my only daughter. That's the truth. He opened his briefcase and took out a stack of documents. This is a divorce agreement. I've already contacted a lawyer, including claims for compensation. Everything will proceed as written here. Lillian broke into sobs. But where should we go? That's your problem, Richard replied coldly. It's time to pay the price for 20 years of lies. He turned and walked upstairs to his study. Closing the door behind him, he finally let go of the composure he had held for so long. With a deep sigh, he collapsed into his chair. On the desk sat a photo of him and Clara, a commemorative picture from the day she graduated from nursing school. He picked it up and gently traced Clara's smile with his finger. Clara, he whispered, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Morning light streamed through the window of a small Boston apartment. In a room at Rachel Moore's place, Clara sat quietly on the sofa, reading a book. Her body was still fragile. Faint scars remained on her face, but a calm peace surrounded her. A knock came at the door. Rachel opened it, revealing Richard Bennett standing outside. Clara. Richard saw his daughter instantly. He stepped forward and knelt beside the sofa. Clara, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Clara took his hand, her eyes filling with tears. Dad, do you know everything? Yes, Richard nodded. Everything. I read your letter. I saw the evidence. The lies, the abandonment, how no one was there for you during the worst moment of your life. My colleagues were, Clara smiled softly. They were like a real family. 1 month later, Clara and her father moved into a new apartment together. Richard had resigned from the company he'd served for decades and accepted a position at another firm in Boston. He had chosen to live and work near his daughter to begin again. How's the position of this shelf? He asked, holding a bookshelf steady against the living room wall. Perfect, Dad, Clara smiled. Her condition improved day by day. In the evenings, Clara's colleagues visited frequently. Laughter and warmth filled their new home, creating bonds stronger than blood. You saved my daughter, Richard said at one dinner, raising his glass to Rachel and the others. You showed us what a real family looks like. The aftermath for Lillian and Sophie unfolded just as expected. When Greg, Lillian's longtime lover, was exposed by his wife, he severed all ties and disappeared. Financially strained and socially isolated, Lillian began working part-time at a high-end boutique to make ends meet. Sophie, armed with the DNA report, attempted to contact her biological father. But Greg rejected her coldly. Don't bring up past mistakes, he said. Estranged and embittered, mother and daughter grew distant. each blaming the other in days filled with silence and regret. On Christmas night, Clara's apartment glowed with warm light and laughter. Around the dining table, Clara, Richard, and her hospital colleagues shared smiles, stories, and a deep sense of belonging. A letter arrived in the mailbox. The sender was Lillian. "Aren't you going to open it?" Richard asked. Clara shook her head. Without a word, she tossed the letter into the trash bin, unopened. "The past is over," she said. "We have a new future." "Cheers," Rachel said, raising her glass. "To real family." "To real family," they echoed, clinking their glasses together. Clara looked out the window at the starry winter sky. Her revenge was complete. But more importantly, she would no longer let hatred consume her. What remained was hope. A new beginning. "Family isn't just about blood," she said quietly. "It's the heart that chooses you, that stays with you. That's what makes a real family." Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulder and nodded. Their new story would begin from here. Ultimately, Clara raised her life rather than her voice. Choosing peace, creating something beautiful out of what tried to break you, and leaving without turning around can sometimes be the most effective form of retaliation. Set boundaries, choose recovery, and keep in mind that your value is independent of anyone's betrayal if you've been harmed. Have you ever been betrayed in a way that altered who you are? We read all of your stories, so please share yours in the comments. This is not a place for humiliation, but for growth. Because sometimes the strength that reverberates the loudest is the quietest. What made it easier for you to move on?